Из той кучи, которые перемешаны. Я лучше купила пакетики по цветам. It's 14th of April. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation today. My name is Vasyl Samakvalov, and our guest today is Serhii Kuiun, director of A95 Consultant Group. Good afternoon, Mr. Serhii. Good afternoon, Mr. Serhii. We will be talking about the fuel, its price, and some specific factors that may influence that price, and we would like to find out your opinion. Factor number one, sowing campaign has started in Ukraine. Has it affected the price of fuel in any way? In fact, if there was some effect, it only influenced the decrease of the price, because just this week the prices went down a little bit more than 1 hryvnia. In some chains they went almost 3 hryvnias down for diesel fuel, and that was the same situation that we were observing even before the beginning of the Great War. The phenomena when everybody wants to make some money in spring, they bring a lot of fuel for the sowing campaign, but now all the retailers do so, and they overfuel the market and create huge reserves, which results in the fact that everybody tries to sell as much and fuel and as quickly as possible with minimal profit margin. And this is the same situation we're observing today. And it's obvious that the demand is low, including due to the weather conditions, but also due to the war, because we see that all types of fuel, the consumption of them decreased. For example, the consumption of diesel decreased 30%. In case of gas, it's 20%, and the liquefied gas consumption decreased almost twice, which resulted in the prices going down, which we're observing. And that may be not the last decrease this season, because the traders still have some reserve of resilience, so to say. Then factor number two, possible return of the taxes, of the pre-war taxes. I'm talking about the VAT and how that would affect the price of the fuel. Well, taxation of fuel is obviously the taxes being paid by the consumer, so any growth will be paid by the consumer, and the tax component is a very serious, it's a very significant component in the price of fuel, because first is excise tax and then another is VAT. Now there is the increase of taxes, or I would rather say the return of the pre-war taxes. Last year in March we returned the excise tax for diesel fuel, gas and liquefied gas, but there was the exemption VAT at the level of 7%. Now it should grow from 7 to 20%, and excise tax for the gas will grow the most. It will grow almost twice, from 100 euro per 1,000 liters now to 2013. Diesel fuel from 100 euro to 139.5 euro per 1,000 liters, and the excise tax will remain unchanged for the liquefied gas. So there will be the most growth for the gas, And if we calculate this tax component, it will result in growth of 11 hryvnias for gas and maybe 2 hryvnias for liquefied gas. And for gas and diesel fuel, those are the big figures, I would say, and the market would not be able to swallow them in a way that the consumer would not feel it. And how can we reduce the consumption then? It's difficult to say for the time being. The high price definitely does not stimulate the consumption. It, on the other hand, presses it down. At some point it's necessary, because I think that the fuel is the second article after the arms in terms of foreign currency spending. The more we consume, the more we spend time, the more we spend money paying for import of fuel, and the less we consume, the less we spend, obviously. Well, talking about the world, what is the global configuration? There were talks about the decrease of mining by OPEC. There are some expectations of growth of Chinese economy. So in fact, I have two questions here: how all those global trends will influence the price of fuel in Ukraine, and what about Russia? Those statements about restriction or limitation of mining that were made by Saudi Arabia, they were unexpected to everybody. The world just started recuperating from the global shocks that we all were going through due to the war in Ukraine. In March 2022, the price reached $140 per barrel, the highest indicator within the last 15 years. And obviously the whole year it was remaining on the high mark at about $100 per barrel, and in the beginning of this year we've seen the price falling down to $70, so everybody started exhaling a little bit, because we remember that the high prices for fuel, they provoked some disagreement and discontent in the United States and Europe. The American president said that the American families suffer from high prices of gas, and now that the prices went down, we have some expectations for them to grow, for their growth. Really, the price grew up almost $10 per barrel, up to $85 per barrel. In the internal market, there was a commotion in the wholesale, and we don't observe any significant leap of prices because we have huge reserves that I mentioned, but that statement was a surprise for both United States and Europe, and everybody understands that. First of all, there is some unpleasant bingo, because everybody will see the prices grow, first of all, and secondly, it is assistance to Russia, who will get more proceeds due to the growth of oil prices, the proceeds from their export. And the situation was looking quite good, because the oil sanctions and petroleum product sanctions imposed on Russia, they started working. The Russian tankers were trying to find any breaches to re-enter the global market. They reoriented to some remote regions, which means that you have to bring your oil over there at your own cost, and then sell it with discount over there, because they were selling the oil at $50–45 per barrel at market price above 65, so the market realities were pressing on them, and now they will start selling their oil at higher price, and all those efforts that were taken to impose those efforts all those efforts taken to impose those sanctions, that work will in part be ruined. And I hope that the situation is being analyzed in Europe and in the United States, and I see it as a knife in the back from the Saudis. So I think that the response will be found to retain the prices or bring them back to the lower level. Well, that's clear. Any questions from the floor? Valentin Marchuk, Ukraine floor. There is the information that part of the Russian fuel ends up in Ukraine through different ways. How should we counter it? What barriers should we build to counter this process? For the time being, the situation is most complicated with the supplies of the liquefied gas. What we see is in March more than 70% of import was from Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. So those are the mixes of fuel. It doesn't say in the documents that it comes from Russia. It says it comes from Europe. However, where do they get it in Europe from? It comes from Russia. Poland is the biggest importer of the Russian liquefied gas in this quarter. A lot of it comes to Latvia and Lithuania because the liquefied gas is not under sanctions, unlike other types of fuel, and it comes to Europe without obstacles. They make new documents for it. It's been legalized as the European gas, and then it comes here. Why does it come in such big amounts? Because it's very cheap. According to the traders, it's 30% cheaper than non-Russian equivalents in the European market, which results in different destructive effects. So when the companies terminate their contracts with non-Russian suppliers, they have to terminate the lease or the rent of their railway cisterns or tanks for moving the liquefied gas, and it creates the threat in a way that if this Russian liquefied gas disappears, we end up without any supplies, because the contracts cannot be renewed so promptly. So that non-Russian gas will be contracted by other buyers, and we will need time to bring it to Ukraine. Well, this is the dangerous situation from all points of view. First of all, in terms of security, and also from the ethical point of view. I mean, that we buy this Russian gas. In principle, I've seen the good news before this broadcast that Baltic countries stated they want to voluntarily terminate the import of Russian liquefied gas to their countries. So it will be only Poland remaining. There is a very powerful industry opposition that stands for preserving those supplies, for to keep the prices on the low level, to ensure the stable supply in the market. But the signal we're getting from the Baltic countries is very cool, because we on our own feel it quite difficult to counter it, because there are mechanisms that even legally allow us to supply, if not only Russian gas, clean Russian gas, so it only mixed liquefied Russian gas. On the other hand, we don't see any active steps on part of the Ukrainian government, which accepts proposals from the Ukrainian market players as to the intensification of inspections of the liquefied gas which is being supplied. For example, the imposition of mandatory certificates and mandatory certificates from chambers of commerce of different countries about the origin of that gas. Even if it's a mix, what was it made of? And if Russian gas prevails in that mix, it will be banned from supply to Ukraine. Unfortunately, what we see is government does not react in any way to such proposals, and I hope that it will happen eventually, though. There are other problems with regard to the diesel fuel, but some beacons, some signals are emerging in this market as well. There are small tankers, small batches are attempted to be transported to Romania or Bulgaria. It comes to those countries as clearly Russian, and there are supplies from Turkey. As we know, Turkey is the biggest importer of Russian petroleum products and raw oil. We have to add our sanction agencies, and we should start pondering over the matter how to counter it within the limits of our legislation. Also, another question: during the martial law, under conditions of constant Russian shellings, how can we create the national reserve of the fuel, and what will be the role of government in this process? Well, it's a very important question too. We see that it's important to have the reserve of fuel. How important it is when the full-scale war has begun. We've seen that the absence of such reserve, we felt it very well. And since the commercial traders had this reserve, it allowed us to preserve resilience for another month, and we could go successfully through May and in part through June thanks to those provisions of the traders. On the well, we need those reserves, but on the other hand, where can we store them? The enemy demonstrates that they keep the industry in their crossbow, so to say. There were reports of the shellings of the oil bases, and some of those damages were reported, some of them were not, some were even unknown oil silos. But how it works now, we keep a lot of fuel on the wheels, in the tanks, in the railway cars, automobile tanks, and it all keeps moving without staying in some specific spot, which increases their security of such storage. There are also big batches at the pump stations. The companies, the chains keep refueling their pump stations, so no one would target any specific pump stations. There are storages used by some industrial facilities and in some agrarian facilities, but those are not so big reservoirs, which are not very valuable. As to the prospects, we were discussing it during a recent conference that we gathered recently, and we discussed that specific issue of creation provisions, and one of the options is to keep some accumulation points abroad so that they could be quickly supplied to Ukraine. Well, it's not so smooth, because first of all we need some areas to establish those storage facilities outside Ukraine, and then how the companies should prove that it's their reserves that they keep abroad and they should remain intact. So there are some mechanic moments that are being discussed for the time being. We understand that if we force those companies to bring the fuel to Ukraine and store it in Ukraine, it will result in risks and maybe even losses. So it's good that this process started moving, and our European partners, they help us in this movement is good, because we had to have those provisions this year already. This is our obligation within the framework of the energy strategy, but it does not, such provisions do not exist, but the work is underway, there are discussions going on, so I hope there will be some gradual increase of such provisions and we will have some secure storage. So we're moving on, this movement is in progress. Thank you very much for your holistic answers. Joining us was Serhii Kuiun, the chairman of A95 Consulting Group. We will see you in 10 minutes. Joining us will be Vyacheslav Chaus, the military governor of Chernihiv region, and we will talk about the floods and the security situation in the region. See you shortly.